biggest decisions are hard to analyze. You can make a lot of pros and a lot of cons, and you look at it, it doesn't always lead to a clear answer. A lot of times I find when I face big decisions, it's not a question of sitting down and deciding. By the time that decision is in front of me, I already know what I think the answer is.
Welcome to Grey Matter. I'm Declan Kelly, founder, chairman, and CEO of Consello. I've spent the last 30 plus years advising the CEOs who are leading the world's top companies. If there's one thing I've learned in that time, the best leaders think differently. That wiring, that grey matter, separates the truly exceptional leaders from everyone else. Understanding it is what allows us at Consello to help the best in the world be even better. This podcast exists because the most accomplished leaders agreed to sit down and talk about something they rarely discuss publicly: how their minds actually work. Over 4 decades at the highest levels of finance, Tony James has made a career of spotting high-growth opportunities before anybody else. At DLJ, he created the leverage buyout and private capital businesses that became the model for the rest of the entire industry. While leading Blackstone, he built entirely new investment businesses, and he transformed that firm into the world's largest alternative asset manager. As chairman of Costco, he has safeguarded the membership model that made it one of the most distinct and successful retailers in the entire world. Each time, his instincts have led to significant growth and reshaped how entire industries operate. His mark on the business world has been profound and also long-lasting. This is Tony's story. This is Grey Matter. Tony James, good morning and welcome to Grey Matter.
Thank you, Declan. Nice to see you.
Thank you for inviting us into your wonderful home. We look out on Central Park here. Even though you were born in Michigan and grew up in Boston and went to school in Harvard, New York has always been central to your story. And I guess this sort of resonates with you when you look out that window very much.
I know, you can't help but feel really lucky to look at that every day. And there's the city right at your feet, the biggest city in America. I would argue one of the most vibrant in the world. I just love it.
The thing I didn't realize about you when I was looking into your history, even though we know each other so well, I didn't realize you were a soccer player. When you went to college, you were a walk-on a soccer team and won and got to the NCAA Final Four 3 times. Nobody knows that about you. So how did that all come about?
Well, I grew up in a small town and we had one sport and it was soccer, and I loved it. And I went to Choate, hoped to play, but got very sick my first year and never got on that track, and then decided maybe the better route to college was tutoring handicapped kids. When I got to college, I think we all in college struggle in our first few years, finding our way. Who am I? Am I going to make it? Things like that. And soccer was an antidote to that. I could go out there on that field. I could play my heart out with those guys. It was simple. It was one-dimensional. I never thought about, am I going to fail out of Harvard or anything like that. I never thought about what kind of person am I going to be. That really helped, and it gave me a whole new set of friends. It served a lot of purposes other than just playing soccer. But actually, when I cut through it, it was just fun.
You don't like to talk about yourself. In fact, I know you don't do interviews like this, which I really appreciate. But you grew up in a very interesting household where your dad was the president of Arthur D. Little, and so you had a front seat looking straight into the world of corporate America from a young age. That must have been extremely formative in terms of how you thought of the world.
It was. It certainly oriented me towards business right from the start, because he was a management consultant and he traveled all over the world, and we talked a lot about business problems. And I liked that. I found that interesting. I would say my dad was a tough guy. He was known in Arthur Little as the Prussian Army general. And I think part of that was his nature, and some of that I have and sometimes need to be mindful of. But some of it also came from World War II. He went into World War II at 19 and was a forward observer for Patton, so it was always behind enemy lines, directing the troops and the artillery. 3 times when he was in a Jeep when the driver next to him was killed. 3 times.
Wow.
Once he got into Germany, he liberated concentration camps and just was in the Battle of the Bulge. Saw the worst of the worst, and he came out of there with what I think today we would call PTSD, which made him kind of aggressive and angry and difficult man. There's no 2 ways about it. I loved him, I respected him, but boy, did we butt heads.
I guess you learned yourself by watching that how not to be that, because you are known for being tough in business, but also being empathetic.
I did try to very much learn from that. And I think his kind of over toughness capped his career at the end of the day. I think he got right up below the CEO, but didn't make the CEO, and that was a great disappointment to him. But more than that, I dealt with the consequences of it, and I didn't want to be exactly that person. There was a lot to admire about him, but I keep trying to mitigate my own personality to make sure I don't fall into some of the same traps.
When you look at your academic record and your history, which again, not many people may be aware of, but it's astounding. You know, you were a Baker Scholar at HBS, you were a John Harvard Scholar, you were first in your class, you were a walk-on to the football team, and all the things you've done in your career. This academic aspect of you and the ability to sort of parse through things that really matter and get to the point has really been there since you were quite young.
That was never my self-image, actually. Up until high school, I guess, I thought I was okay. There were smarter kids. All the girls seemed smarter than all the guys. They probably were. And I was content to kind of do my thing. I always felt like my secret power, I guess, was just grit and willing to put up with more pain than just about anyone else. When I played football, you know, it was tackle football, but it was pick up, no pads. I would hit as hard as I possibly could. I would barely be able to get up. But the big guy I hit, he didn't want to get hit again. Didn't hurt him as much as it hurt me. But I always felt like I had the ability just to really just grind it out. And whenever I got really threatened or had real problems, I fell back on that. I try not to get overwhelmed. My successor at Blackstone, John Gray, says it really well. He says, "Stay calm, stay positive, never give up." It's kind of a mantra, and I didn't articulate it that well, but I lived that, and it always served me well. I never, and I'm competitive. Let's face it.
But you also, as we'll talk about in a minute, are very patient, even though you don't think of yourself as patient. If you look at all the various things that you've done over an extended period of time, if you knew it took a while to get there, you showed great patience, which I think is the other side of leadership. And, you know, when you left college, you could have gone anywhere. You were offered jobs by everybody, and you chose DLJ, which was an unusual choice. Why did you choose DLJ?
That's a good question. I think part of it was ignorance, candidly. But what I liked about DLJ, let's focus on that, was it was young, it was growing. The people were down to earth. The big banks, the Morgan Stanleys, the Goldman Sachs, felt so stiff and so regimented. I would say when I got out of school, my biggest fear was not being able to fully utilize my brain and my creativity. And I didn't see how slotting into one of those big regimented organizations would be very conducive for that. I also was never someone that had a great respect for authority, or I kind of like doing my own thing or being my own boss, I guess. And again, those regimented organizations with layers and layers and layers of authority and central control just didn't feel like as good a fit. It was where you had a young, growing, fluid kind of company where I could have immediate impact beyond what I deserve and get opportunities driven by the growth of the firm, not just my own personal growth. And so I made an instant choice. As I do in life, I make pretty much instant gut choices.
Do you do that a lot?
I do, yeah.
Really? Not the analytical element? Or is there an emotional aspect to how you think about these things at all?
The biggest decisions are hard to analyze. You can make a lot of pros and a lot of cons, and you look at it, and it doesn't always lead to a clear answer. Investment decisions, things like that, I'm very analytical. But life decisions, should I get married or not? Should I go take that job or this job? Should we get into a new business or not? A lot of times I find when I face big decisions, it's not a question of sitting down and deciding. By the time that decision is in front of me, I already know what I think the answer is.
I came across an article from 1986 that described you at the time. It was the Wall Street Journal as an up-and-coming M&A whiz kid. Not that long afterwards, you were running the entire M&A group. And there was something about the culture. You know, when I came to New York first in 2000, 25 years ago, people talked about DLJ as that was the model, that was the business, that was the one that really differentiated itself. And it became the standard bearer for so many different cultural aspects of how you run these businesses. You were right there in the middle of that. What was it like?
That's a very insightful comment. And just to reinforce that before I actually answer the question, even now, DLJ people get together at least a couple times a year in big groups and just celebrate the old feeling, the old firm. I've never seen anything quite like it. There's still just a love of that firm. I think it partly stemmed from Dick Jenrette, who was a wonderful gentleman and cared about his people, I mean, deeply and authentically. But partly it was just the way that culture developed and was built. I'm not sure anyone necessarily mapped it out, but it happened and it worked and we kept reinforcing it. It was all about team. It was all about empowering your people, pushing down authority. 100% of our people's time was out there trying to beat the competition and serve the client, never internal politics. There was no politics. We had a reputation for being well paid, but actually, in point of fact, we were like 7 out of 8. And people wanted to believe they were well paid because they loved the firm and they wanted an excuse to say. They convinced themselves of that. And we had very low turnover, and our people just felt really good about their lives. And it's amazing what you can do if you have a group of people that play like a team, believe in themselves, and always want to do the right thing.
So what I find really interesting in this whole era of your life, because I believe that you, in many ways, are the father of an entire industry. The way you approached what you did in DLJ and then subsequently at Blackstone, everybody else has copied the model that you personally created. Inside of DLJ, you know, CEO and all the leaders like you used to go to the canteen and eat their sandwiches with the people. And I remember when you sold to Credit Suisse First Boston, 2 years later you left, but I think one of the reasons people think you left is that entire specialness went away because you replaced it with a very, very big company. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. When we sold DLJ, I was the one employee where as part of the merger agreement, had to agree to stay for 2 years. And I don't mean to say that I was forced into that, because I would have done that anyway for my people, 100%. By then, I had gotten to be the number 2 person at DLJ, and I lived for my team and my teams, actually. And I felt such a burden to take care of them. This merger was, I mean, in some ways it was brilliant, i.e., we picked the all-time peak at the time of the market. We sold DLJ for $12 billion. Morgan Stanley sold a much bigger firm a few years later for $8 billion. We got all cash. And DLJ did not have the capabilities to survive and succeed as an independent company. I saw that, but a lot of the people didn't. So they kind of blamed me for selling them down the river. Into a merger, I mean, we had to take that price. It was by far the best price for our shareholders. Above all else, we owed our shareholders the best price. But it was the culture differences were so different. Instead of empowerment and believing in your people and playing like a team, it was central control. Don't trust your people to do anything. Don't even trust the people that watch them. They need watchers to watch the watchers. And politics reigns. And it was just so different. Even though on paper, Credit Suisse, the 4th largest securities firm, DLJ was the 5th. It was and together they were number 1. But this was 1 + 1 = 1 at the end of the day. When I started right after the merger, I had 4,200 people in investment banking. I had responsibility for investment banking and derivatives and international and merchant banking, all the alternatives businesses. We had 4,200 people when we started, 2,200 2 years later. That was a lot of bloodletting. And while that happened, though, the good thing about selling at the peak was we got a great price. The bad thing was we then had a downturn that was very severe going into the 2000 and bloodletting everywhere. And we weren't prepared for that. We were still trying to figure out the merger, much less preparing for a very severe downturn. And it was brutal.
Before all that happened, when you built DLJ and did what you did with the team, you know, you took what was a traditional banking business and you turned it into a merchant bank. You started doing things nobody ever expected you to do, investing your own capital, proprietary deals, and then you started expanding beyond that into all the other things that now become the normal model that we have today. When you were doing that at the time, were you conscious of the fact that you were building something that didn't exist on Wall Street? Of course, you couldn't predict that the entire world would copy it for decades later, but at that moment, were you sitting there? Because I think everybody watching this will really want to know what you were thinking at the time, because it was incredibly prescient.
Well, first of all, 100% conscious, but I wouldn't give myself credit for being prescient so much as necessity. So I was at DLJ. It was nothing of a firm. There were hundreds of bigger brokerage firms. Many of them are out of business today, but think about Lehman Brothers and Loeb Rhodes and E.F. Hutton and Payne Weber and on and on and on and on and on. Not to mention Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and all the really big guys. We were trying to compete against giants. Our firm was founded in the 60s, giants that had been in business since the 30s, and the embedded relationships. The challenge was, how do we find a way to win? We're not going to find a way to beat Goldman Sachs by being more, or Morgan Stanley by being more corporate or more traditional or bigger, or beat Merrill Lynch with bigger balance sheets or more brokers or anything. We had less of everything than everyone else. So to me, it was all about how do we win? And then this funny little business started up in about 1980. There were a couple of deals, leveraged buyouts done. And I was running the M&A group then, and DLJ had a little venture capital business. So we had seen the power of investing our own capital. So I put up my hand and I said to the then leader of the firm, I'd like to get us into this business. This is an interesting thing for us that I'd much rather compete against. I mean, no one had heard of KKR then. They were there, or Forsman Little or Gibbons Green were the big three. Only one of them exists today, but you'd much rather compete against KKR than Goldman Sachs. KKR had like 5 people. And the management predictably said, no, you're an M&A guy. We're going to give this to the venture capital people because they're the principals. And I kept showing them deals, and they kept saying, no, that doesn't work. And then some other firm would do the deal. And finally, the firm said, okay, you can have it. And so we built on that right away. We couldn't necessarily win our clients in a head-to-head competition, but if we owned them, guess who got the business? And then to facilitate the leveraged buyout business, we needed to build a high-yield business. And then when the downturn came, DLJ became a dominant high-yield firm for a dozen years, accounting for 40% of all the trading volume. So there's very few firms that are as dominant a niche as we were. And then there was another credit, 87, when I think we had the S&L crisis. So then we created the restructuring business, the restructuring advisory business. That didn't really exist except for boutique firms. And one thing led to another, and we created all these businesses around the ecosystem. And then, of course, we created new private capital businesses, real estate and private credit and funds of funds and so on. And it was what we could do. And it was our end run around the entrenched big guys that allowed us to win.
When you're walking around the Upper East Side or anywhere else, and you're sitting looking at all these storied firms that now basically took the entire playbook and said, okay, we're going to do it just like that. In your private moments, when you think about how it all came about, you created an architecture that the rest of Wall Street copied.
That's almost more true of Blackstone than DLJ, because at DLJ, other firms did try to have embedded inside their firms these principal businesses. But then in 2007, they all melted. So not many firms actually sustain that model anymore. They have pieces of it. They have the high yield, they have restructuring, and they have some pieces of the business. And this is one of the things that made the Credit Suisse deal not work so well, is the bankers, when we merged, the traditional bankers with all these corporates hated the fact that the DLJ side of it brought ownership of companies, because they didn't want Credit Suisse to own a piece of a company that competed with a client. I would say the weight of the employees was heavily Credit Suisse, maybe 80-20. Profits were about equal, but the employees were 80-20. And we couldn't win that weight of resistance against the principal business, and one after another, they just kind of got dismantled.
So when you left and you went to Blackstone, again, an unusual choice. Could have gone to lots of places. And you've described your relationship with Steve Schwarzman as one in a gazillion, where you basically, were the yin and yang perfectly to each other. What was your reasoning for going there in the first place?
First of all, Blackstone had had its struggles for a couple of years. Steve been trying to change it, and he wanted to make change. And so he reached out to me when I decided to leave. It was almost a perfect match. Blackstone's range of businesses, they had advisory business and they had principal businesses. I had run and built every single one of those businesses without exception. And there's no one else in the world that had done that. So it was a unique fit. They had just the perfect portfolio of businesses, and I was the only one out there that had really built all those businesses from M&A, restructuring, so on and so forth, all the different principal business, all of them. And so that was a kind of a unicorn. And then Steve and I are very different in terms of personality types and how we arrive at decisions. But we were a great team. We almost always agreed, and we got along very well. And he was the best boss I've ever had, actually. The combination of empowerment, which he did for me, and engagement, not being divorced from the key business decisions, always there when we needed them, setting the ambition, setting the intensity, setting the tone of the firm. He was a great partner, great boss.
And you ended up creating an entire palette, smorgasbord of businesses that were the entire combination of all the things that you wanted to do. That was the first time, I think, in financial services that the word trillion was ever used.
When I went to Blackstone, it was more like going to a law firm,
right?
A small partnership. AIG we had 20 billion of assets under management scattered around a few businesses, and some of which were shrinking and some of which were growing. And we had some advisory businesses that had fallen 60%, 70% over the last 5 years. It was kind of a nice little boutique. It was different from some other firms, and it had a mix of businesses. And the firm had just taken $100 million from AIG that valued the firm at $1 billion. When I left, it was a $150 billion business, and we'd gone from 20 billion of AUM to $1 trillion. So it was a run that was wildly more than we expected. But the whole economy and markets changed. It wasn't just Blackstone succeeding alone. There was a titanic shift in public to private capital markets. And we saw a lot of it. Honestly, we were in the right place at the right time. And we had our surfboard and we were top of the wave. And we rode it.
Speaking of the top of the wave, you of course went public. The IPO was very successful. Interestingly, I read that Steve wasn't in the New York Stock Exchange that day. You were. He was in the office and you guys were communicating. The financial crisis occurred and you did something completely counterintuitive yet again when you did the GSO deal, which got you into credit, private credit and so forth at a time when everybody else was losing their minds. And so the stock went down 40%. Everybody thought, oh my God. And all of a sudden, here you are buying up distressed assets all over the place. And that really was one of the making of the company. Again, intentional.
Going public wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a whole new leg. If we hadn't gone public, we could do pretty well as a private company, but we wouldn't create a great financial institution, a global financial institution, one that we aspired to be more respected than Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, and to take our place with JP Morgan or so on. Going public was an enabler of that. One of the ways it enabled that was the ability to have currency to do acquisitions. That was the first big one. It was $1 billion to buy a fairly small business and a talented team, but it was not the easiest decision in the world either. But what people don't really appreciate was Blackstone did maybe 15 acquisitions. It wasn't just one or two. And they all worked out in terms of economic return. They weren't all equally strategically impactful, but we got a great return on all of them. And that's unusual in our industry. The history of firms merging, there wasn't much to start with, or big firms buying boutique firms was not good at all. So we had to be, we were mindful of that.
What was your operating style over all those years? Like, how do you think about how you ran the firm? Because everybody credits you with, doing so many amazing things, and you've left a great legacy, and John is now doing an amazing job himself. And obviously Steve has been there for it all. But your operating style, people have told me, you know, you'll argue over a comma for an hour,
I kind of,
especially a decimal point.
I'm not
Maybe a
sure that's
comma.
good.
Over the years, you obviously changed a lot, but maybe you didn't change that much. What do you think?
I think culture is really critical. That's the key determination of whether a company succeeds or fails in the very long term. And it's about the only enduring competitive advantage you can get. DLJ had it. I saw the power of that. Costco has it. I saw the power of that. I think Blackstone has it. I saw the power of that. But when I came to Blackstone, I felt like I needed to rehabilitate the culture. I had gone in the wrong direction. So number one, I'm a big believer in culture, and some of those tenets are teams beat individual talent every time. So, and true team, where you really root for each other, help each other without ask, help each other without incentives, true team mentality, share information, share relationships seamlessly. So teams beat individuals. I'm a huge believer in robust debate. So we can argue and debate a point, but I'm never attacking you. We're just trying to get to the right answer, to truth together. That's a trick because so many people sometimes feel personally attacked, and then the whole process breaks down. So you have to establish that we're just trying to get to truth, and whatever we decide, we own it together. If it doesn't work, it's a joint decision. That's a big one for me. I don't think there's any substitute for hard work. And I always led by example on that. And no corner cutting. So the comma point, yeah, I read all the memos every time, every exhibit, not to catch commas, but to make sure that the rigor and the quality of the work was as highest it could possibly be, because someone was looking. and you learn things on that. But more importantly than what you learned is the message it sends to the teams that they have to be that good, because they never know when the boss is going to really dig into something that they didn't think rigorously about. And that kind of gets to maybe the last one of just intellectual rigor and intellectual honesty of looking hard at facts, not opinions, not people that think they'd have the answers and pontificate. What do the facts say? An investment, that's one thing, but when it's looking at your own business, that makes you very self-critical sometimes. I mean, we're not as good as we think. No one ever is. Reinventing our business was always something that I wanted to push, because it's very easy for the industry leader to get complacent. But man, in financial markets, they change fast. And you got to be reinventing all the time.
I was looking at a lot of the different things that you worked on in Blackstone, when you were there. And I was fascinated about the day you walked into Steve's office and told him, that you were going to retire. Nobody realizes that you did it 15 years ahead of time. Right. So you told him you were going to retire at 70, but you were only 55.
Well, I would say the 70 was somewhat arbitrary, obviously. It's a round number. But the point was, I'm not a short-termer, but I'm not a forever person either. And that had certain implications right away. Steve will be there forever. Essentially, Pete Peterson was there till very near the end. And I didn't want that expectation in Steve's mind, which meant I was never going to be Steve's successor, because he's only 4 years older than I am, and he's going to be there forever. But more than that, I'd already done, I'd had DLJ, I'd had a great run. I felt I had the energy, intellectual and physical, to do other things and make differences in other spheres. And I didn't want to not do that. After 20 years running a company, if you haven't put your strengths into that organization, you're probably not going to do it. And I'm kind of a believer that CEO should, maybe 20 years is too long. A lot of people would say it was, but after 10 or 20 years, CEOs should change. It brings vibrancy and renewal to the organization. At Blackstone, I was lucky because I had a great successor, and he's doing things differently than I did and doing them well. Everyone wins on that. But yeah, I wanted to go on and do other things and conquer other worlds.
Well, you conquered one in Costco, because when you met the two founders, and it was a really small little business in Seattle, I think the cultural phenomenon that you all have created in that business it's extraordinary. And you've been associated with that business now for 5 decades, and still are today as the chair of the business. What first attracted you to Costco?
the two founders, and particularly Jim Senegal, was absolutely one of the best business people I've ever come in contact with, and I've come in contact with thousands and thousands and thousands. He's a remarkable combination of passion and leadership and execution and strategy and principles and maniacal attention to detail, relentless work ethic. He traveled 270 days a year or something. I mean, you know, he was an amazing man, and he could do anything. There was another company called Price Club that had opened a couple of these units. So it's not like, is this a new semiconductor technology, will it or won't it work? It was shown that it could work. If it could work anywhere, Jim would make it better. Of course, he was number 2 at Price Club. That didn't hurt. If anyone in the world could make it work, he would, and he would make it better and better and better. So to me, it was, wow, this is great. And the concept was powerful. It was new, it was powerful, it was completely self-reinforcing. Yeah, there's a lot to like about it.
And what about the decision to have a culture in the company that you protect management from having to worry about the share price? In other words, you do the right thing, share price will take care of itself. But actually, very few people do that. So to have a culture where from the top you say, do it this way, don't worry about that, it's going to be totally fine, is quite rare in actuality.
Well, we tried to have that at Blackstone too, I would say. And if you look at the cover of our prospectus of Blackstone, it says it says to shareholders, it's only the second time you've ever had one of these notices on the cover of the prospectus. Warren Buffett put one on Berkshire Hathaway when it went public. You shouldn't buy these shares because we don't care about you. We're only going to manage this for our LPs, for our customers. Of course, what that did at the time was it created a feeding frenzy. It's my orientation, but it's also the orientation of Jim Senegal and Steve Schwarzman. They're owners. None of them have ever sold a share. They want to build something great. They have that ambition. So did I. And I think the best companies in the world, that's how they run. If you start worrying about the short term, you start making suboptimal decisions.
Costco competes every day against Amazon, okay? And the history of both businesses couldn't be more different. And so you take that culture and evolve it so rapidly and so quickly so that it becomes competitive. What have you learned watching that business that's different than any of the other businesses you've overseen, bought, run, et cetera?
I've never seen a company that sticks as religiously to just exactly one thing and doing it really, really, really well. Where Costco beats the competition is just executes much better. No one else is as efficient, as driven. They never get fancy. They never think about what other businesses could I add. And they have these really, really strong principles of customer first, customer first, customer first. We call them members, but members first. And then employees. And then if we do a really good job for our customers and our employees, thank you very much, shareholders will do fine over time. But if you want to sell tomorrow, great, go sell tomorrow because you're not a shareholder anymore.
And the $1.50 hot dog measurement criteria is legendary, of course. And I think Jim has said if the price ever goes above $1.50, then he's going to kill somebody, whoever does it.
I think he said, I think it was, what will it mean if the price goes up $1.50? And I think Jim said it'll mean I'm dead, but I don't think he's going to kill anyone. That's kind of odd because it never used to quite be that way, and it's taken on this cult, almost like a meme in the last few years. At some point, we'll probably have to raise the price, but
not on your watch.
Not on my watch. I don't want to face Jim, or I don't want to face the press storm.
You also care an awful lot about retirement and people in this country having enough money in their old age. So on the one hand, you're a capitalist, but on the other side, you're obviously a lifelong Democrat, and you've devoted yourself to a lot of public service elements that we'll talk about in a moment. But you wrote a book in 2016, which you believe is a solution for retirement for people in this country. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy on that and what you see going on around you today?
When you're lucky enough to have the access and the influence and the resources that I fell into, I feel like it's everyone's obligation to give some of that back and to try to make the rest of the world better. When it came to retirement, because we do manage pension funds and 401ks and people's savings, the problem of retirement security was front and center for us. We watched pension funds dwindle and defined contribution plans, 401ks, grow up, but people weren't investing well. And retirement security was, back then, the number one worry of people in America, 80% of Americans worried about that, including people right out of college that have huge student loans, but they worried more about their retirement security. That says something. And we are not on a good trajectory. Social Security isn't necessarily running out of money, but it's certainly wheezing. Savings rates are going down. The boom in the stock market that really went from, and in American economy that went from World War II into the 90s may not continue. And so no one was talking about it. So I felt like we needed to call attention to the issue politically and in Washington. And the best way to do that was to come up with a plan that worked, but that wasn't so offensive to Republicans or Democrats that one side or the other just completely rejects it. Because then you have nothing. Then there's no dialogue. So our challenge was to come up with a plan that could appeal to both sides so they'd be talking about it. And we had both Republicans and Democrat supports. And we came up with a plan that really made a big difference to the problem over time, with no new taxes, no increase in the deficit, and no new bureaucracy. It just repurposed a lot of what's there, and it worked. And it worked partly by changing some flows, but partly also by investing better. Investing capital better is in a way costless to the taxpayer or to the government, and good for the economy because there's more capital that goes into growing the economy. So I found a labor economist, and her ideas and mine kind of dovetailed. She had half the loaf, I had half the loaf. We put it together and wrote this book. Most importantly, we wrote it so that a senator or a congressman could skim through the whole thing on the train from New York to Washington. If it's some big policy tome like that, they're never going to get through it. So I wanted them to get the whole thing and get the big ideas, but at the same time be academically rigorous. I think it accomplished that. It certainly called attention to the area, and a number of the ideas in there have been embedded in new legislation, although not taken as a whole, but we didn't expect that, honestly.
It would be remiss of me if I didn't ask you a question about your thoughts generally about the country and the world going. Obviously, AI is a huge part of it, but I know you study this thing intensely, and you still obviously have your own company that does investing day to day. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a huge believer in America, honestly. I think it's got remarkable entrepreneurialism, creativity. Capitalism can be excessive at times, maybe, but it's a foundation for growth. If you look at incomes in constant dollars, in 1967, 5% of the population earned over $150,000, over 30% in 2024. So many more affluent people. At the low end, 38% of the people earned less than $50,000 in 1967. It's 21% today. So people are better off. We talk about income inequality, and sure, you've got tons of tech wealth. Look at Elon Musk. There's never been a richer person, but a lot of people are getting better off. And I think that can continue, and I think AI is going to be fuel that drives that further and faster.
You're an optimist about AI?
I see risk, and I see some I'm not talking about values, but I think AI can significantly juice productivity and welfare and people's welfare in America.
Public service, which we haven't really talked about. You obviously served at the Port Authority here. You were asked by President Obama to be Secretary of Commerce, and you turned it down to stay with Blackstone. You're the chair of the Met. You're on the board of multiple things that are for not-for-profit status. That whole point you made about giving back, I think, is central to what you believe as well. I think you've lived that mantra for your entire life. Why did you decide not to go into government?
Part of it was the job. The key task they wanted for that job was to reorganize the Commerce Department with other departments. And wow, that seemed awfully bureaucratic and frankly like tilting into windmills. You know, pull tax out here and put trade in there and so on. And what a waste of time, really. And then when I tried to figure out whether I would be the face of the administration to business, which I thought I could be good at, that wasn't really what they wanted. And then when I tried to see if I would have a seat at the table when the key decisions were being made in the White House about the economy business, I'm not sure that's what they wanted either. So the job had its issues, but beyond that, I decided ultimately I wasn't going to be as effective in Washington, just as a personality type. I try to be very direct all the time. I try to never, I don't really pull punches. I have no power base down there. I could see the country bumpkin getting shredded down there. But probably more important than all of that stuff, I had not groomed a successor yet at Blackstone. And so the good thing about that is it started me on that process. Right away, when I realized, gee, even if I'd wanted the job, I really couldn't take it without abandoning my responsibilities to Blackstone. I said, okay, maybe next time I'll get a different offer, my circumstances will be different, but I better have a successor. And I started grooming John, and I was really lucky to have such a remarkable person.
So when you look back on this amazing life, which hopefully has many years to run, what are your reflections? What are your learnings? What do you think about, that kid that grew up in Boston and lived in that family and oldest of four and all the things that you have been through in your life? You've lived 1,000 lives.
Well, you're nice to say that. I guess for me, I have to be busy. I think it's a bit compulsive, but I also so like contributing to building great institutions, not just DLJ and Costco and Blackstone, but the Met or Mount Sinai Hospital System, a charity I started to help HBCUs in America. I just love building things that make a difference. And it's the ultimate ego gratification, I guess, in a way, to look back and say, I'm proud of that. And it'll live beyond me. And I know from my own happiness and mental acuity and group of friends and so on, being in the world and being engaged with all these things, some of them are hard, but it feeds on itself. And that's where I get everything.
This part of the show is called the Uncharted Walk. We're going to give you questions that you haven't heard before, and you have to give me quick responses. Give me an example of a decision that you've made that you thought at the time you had doubts about, might have been the wrong decision, but turned out to be okay because you listened to people around you.
Right after we went public, we bought GSO. We spent $1 billion on a small team, on a small fund, with no tangible assets. Well, the market was declining.
Other than that,
but it worked out all right. They built an $80 billion business, so it did work out okay, but it was a hairy decision.
what person in your life has been the most influenced?
I'm not sure there's any one person, but a few people jump to mind. Steve Schwarzman, just his ambition, his ability to dream big, and his belief, like I think Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, that one person can change the world. I didn't used to think that, but I've learned from him at Kent. Charlie Munger was a great mentor of mine for 30 years. Wow. Loved Charlie. He had such clarity of vision. So often I would call him up and say, Charlie, I think I'm getting confused here. And he was never confused, never confused. He was great. Jim Senegal, as mentioned, I think one of the greatest CEOs I've ever seen. And the purity of his vision and sticking to principles, I've never seen anything like that.
When was the last time you changed your mind about something and it turned out to be, very important decision that you didn't expect to make, and then all of a sudden you change your mind and something else happened?
I think if I've changed my mind to correct judgment errors, more often than not, it's about hiring people. They've disappointed in one way or another. And that's a tricky thing. You hire all the people that you do hire when you're building an organization. You never get it 100% right. And it's hard to go back on that. I believe that changing one's mind is a strength. You've got to make decisions fast, I believe, and clearly, but they're not all right, so you got to fix them. And when facts change, when you see new ideas, you should change your mind. And I think being nimble about that is one of the things that's made us so good.
What is one or two things about you that people watching this would never expect, would never know?
Well, here we are in New York City wearing blazers. Where I really love to be is wearing my chaps and my cowboy hat and my cowboy boots and riding horses and moving cows from one pasture to another. It's just fantastic.
And how often do you get to do that now?
Oh, 3 or 4 times a year.
What part of your personality have you worked to keep in check or develop over the course of your career?
Well, I have a tendency to be quick to have an opinion and blunt in terms of articulating it. And I learned the hard way that those can be characteristics which come across as threatening or intimidating. And so being softer, keeping my counsel, letting people have their say, uh, being sure to mix a lot of compliments and reinforcement and recognition into the mix, just softening the whole picture.
Okay, last one. Best piece of advice you ever received, and piece of advice you outright rejected and were glad you did.
The latter, I would say, is many, many times in my career, or when I'm dealing with speeches or other things, dealing with people, broad groups of employees, I've been told to dumb it down.
Are you able to do that? I don't think so.
I'm definitely I will do that. I make plenty of dumb mistakes, but I always feel like, no, I'm gonna set a high bar, and I'm gonna have the confidence that the audience will rise to the occasion and will understand it, will appreciate it. And I've found that works better. I don't know best piece of advice, but one that stands out from when I was really early in my career is I worked with a great lawyer, and we went down and we had a drafting session. He said, "Tony, you can't win a war if you try to win every battle." He was right.
Turns out he was. Well, you've won a lot of battles and you've won a lot of wars, and I know you will in the future too. Thank you for spending the morning with me. I really enjoyed it. You're a great man. Thank you, Tony.